Well, let me start with you, Alex. You've been involved in the negotiations about the range of substantive issues that both countries want to talk about, need to talk about. Can you just give a sense of where you've got to, how those talks are going, where you see, in what areas you see there might be the quickest progress towards some agreements? Yeah?
Okay. I mean, what's remarkable, and it was clearly, the process had begun prior to the December 17th announcement, but accelerated really tremendously afterwards, has been the range and the number of issues that both countries have decided to negotiate on. Matter of fact, the range and the number has been so intensive that both sides agreed to create this vehicle called the Bilateral Commission, essentially to act as a traffic cop to give enough space between each of the negotiations, identify the primary goals of it and the scope of the negotiations without actually getting into the negotiations. And so that has been an instrument that has pushed both governments as we bring in completely new players into what had been just a State Department, Cuban Foreign Ministry relationship. We have brought in other agencies to deal with a variety of issues, whether it's law enforcement, civil aviation, counter-narcotics, environmental, postal service, human trafficking. Each of these has their own logic and their own set of negotiators, and we've been moving along. I think on the promise side, I think Senator Flake identified some of the areas that I think we're going to reach progress relatively soon, and I think civil aviation is one of them. I think as reestablishing direct postal services is another one. We have started the process to exchange law enforcement information in ways that were just unthinkable previously. We have set loose a variety of environmental discussions and cooperative ventures that, again, just didn't exist before. Both sides have flagged a range of health-related sets of scientific investigation and opportunities. We've even, on the ground in Haiti, identified areas that our medical personnel can work together in a set of issues. So the range and the depth has really been remarkable. Clearly, there's some issues that are going to be tough. I think the issue on claims is going to be lengthy, but both governments have a lot of expertise in reaching claim settlements, and it's in the interest of both governments to be quite pragmatic about it. So I think both governments are going to approach that in a very pragmatic way. Law enforcement, while the sharing of information is going to be very good, I think a thorny issue for us is the status of U.S. fugitives in Cuba. We have to work on that. That's going to be a difficult issue. And then the final one is human rights, which I think is going to be a complicating part of this relationship. Because
complicating or complicated?
Complicating.
Yeah.
And complex. Because while this impressive range of linkages that we have established and in the process of working rather well, in the backdrop, the Cuban government continues to arrest individuals for the free exercise of speech or assembly. Matter of fact, numbers of short-term arrests have soared in several months. And each time that the Cuban government does these actions, it complicates the relationship because this is an important principle for us.
Just on the civil aviation point, You said you hoped there would be an agreement fairly soon, but as was indicated in questions to Senator Flake, if a Cubana plane flies to the United States, as things stand at the moment, it's liable to be seized. So how do you finesse that? How do you get around it? What would happen?
Well, we have hopefully one more round of negotiations, and this is one of the key issues that we're trying to work around. The short-term solution, I think, is very much as what Senator Flake indicated, is perhaps a code-sharing agreement that would benefit Cubana. There may be some other areas that we would be able to accommodate Cuban concerns. The larger issue of solving the specific Cubana problem or any other Cuban state-owned property here in the U.S. is going to have to be done in the claims discussion. And that's clearly one of the challenges of those sets of discussions. We will be starting the first inaugural set of discussions later this month. And again, it's for that very reason that I think the Cuban government is going to be quite pragmatic in trying to figure out a way to deal with the claims issues, whether it's the property seized on the island or whether it's the judicial attachment decisions here coming from U.S. courts.
Okay, very good. Matthew Borman, you were recently in Cuba, I believe, with Secretary Pritzker. Can you give us a sense of where you think there are untapped opportunities for U.S. exporters in Cuba?
Yes, because of the regulatory changes we've made, excuse me, which Senator Flake alluded to, which essentially allow, under general authorization, exports to go to private sector activities in Cuba. There's quite a bit. You know, we've heard before we went to Cuba, and then we heard directly from Cuban officials that they're estimating about 500,000 Cubans are self-employed, the so-called cuentapropistas, and there's 5,000 agricultural co-ops alone, and then there's co-ops in other sectors, construction and others. So even though it still is primarily a state-run and owned economy, there's already significant private sector activity that's illegal in Cuba. And so one of the things we're trying to do with the discussions that Secretary Pritzker initiated and will continue is talk to the Cubans about how do we match up that change in our regulations with the Cuban system. One of the things we heard, and again Senator Flake alluded to this, is the Cuban import structure doesn't really match up that well because pretty much everything has to go into Cuba through a state-owned enterprise, which is not a limitation in our regulations, but then it goes to wholesalers and then finally to the end user, the customer. So that's something I think the Cubans are going to be thinking about in terms of things that they might do, and that's something we'll continue to talk to them about. But you know, there's always been a big market for U.S. agricultural products. The issue there is financing. We learned that there's about $2.5 billion, more than $2.5 billion remittances that were sent to Cuba last year, and over 50% of those were for small businesses. So there's, I think, a lot of potential for U.S. businesses to sell into that slice of the market, you know, auto repair tools, barbershop tools, hairdressers, the private restaurants, those kinds of things.
I mean, just to be clear, as things stand, have there been any transactions that involve a Cuban end user in the incipient private sector in Cuba managing to import through Alimport, through the government import agency, a U.S. product since last December?
There have. In fact, we have the actual export data in the so-called automated export system, and we've seen since then about 100 exports made under our license exception support for the Cuban people, which is both private sector and then sort of civic groups, non-government groups. So there has been some of that already. It's still a challenge. When we were in Cuba, we also talked to some private sector business people, and they said it is a challenge for them because typically they just bring it in essentially as hand luggage or hand baggage rather than trying to import through a Cuban state-owned import agency, which is very cumbersome for a private sector actor in Cuba. But there have been some.
Yeah. No, I mean, the charter flights, if you just, in Miami Airport, if you just walk past the check-in queues, you can see, international trade going on.
Right.
But
and so that's, for example, the private restaurant owners, that's how they bring their refrigerators, for example, in through that mechanism, which is obviously not an efficient, from an economic viewpoint, that's not an efficient way to do trade.
And to get to a point where there can be kind of large-scale exports, apart from agriculture, where, I mean, things need to change both on Capitol Hill and in Havana, right? I mean,
That's right, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that the Cuban officials we talked to had a better understanding of is how our regulations allow certain types of exports without prior government approval under general authorization, and I think we're hopeful that that's sort of what they're digesting and thinking about to sort of facilitate that from their end.
Right.
And we'll continue the regulatory dialogue sometime next year and continue those discussions with them.
John Smith, let me turn to you. Your agency, your office, has spent its entire life trying to stop any intercourse between Americans and Cuba. You've now been forced into reverse gear. How does it feel?
I would say it's all part of our day job. Cuba is one of the many programs we do, but we also are in the same boat in many ways with Iran. We've been doing the same thing with Burma. So we're used to imposing sanctions on a country when it's in the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States, and we're used to pulling that back and easing sanctions when the same occurs. So it's all part of the work.
And perhaps you could just explain in a summary form what kind of transactions people can now do and what they can't do,
So I think the biggest changes that we've made would be travel. And in terms of travel for Americans who used to have to come, in most cases, to OFAC, ask for a license, fit within one of our 12 categories of license travel that is set by statute. We can't change it. It's determined by statute, and that's part of what Senator Flake was discussing. You used to have to come get a piece of paper from OFAC and we would grant you a license. What we did last January is say within all 12 categories of travel, if you meet certain criteria within those the definitions and the regulations, you no longer have to come to us. You can just go. You can just self-certify and go. And so I think that's been the biggest change. The other sets of changes are openings for the private sector, both businesses as well as civil society, religious organizations, to be able to expand their outreach and their dealings in Cuba.
Right. I mean, you would have heard the question from the gentleman with the hat whose $3,000 is stuck in the system somewhere. I mean, can you help him at all?
We can, and I think we have. This is what happens with the regulatory changes. When we make changes, we try to put out as much detail as we can, and we even go through a process where we guess questions that are going to come up from the regulated community, and we'll put out what we call frequently asked questions on our website to say, how do you respond to this? How do we do certain things? When we were baffled when this occurred, when the banks started holding up some of the money in the last couple months because everything had worked smoothly since our regulatory changes in January. But when we understood that banks had some concerns about whether the bank itself had to individually determine whether the traveler's travel was okay pursuant to our regulations, we issued an FAQ in the past few days that says, does a financial institution need to independently verify? The answer is no. You can rely on the traveler and the traveler carrier service provider. So we've put that now out publicly, and we're working with financial institutions to make sure they understand their obligations and lack thereof.
And just to be clear, an American bank can now set up a representative office in Havana or not yet?
No. An American bank is allowed to establish what's called a correspondent account. They can open an account in a Cuban bank to allow authorized trade to occur. Citibank cannot open a branch in Havana.
No, not a branch, but there are other foreign banks that have a representative office in Havana, and they do some business, particularly on trade financing, for example.
As we understand, I was part of the trip to Havana recently. As we understand, there are no other foreign banks other than Cuban banks that are currently operating in Havana. There are a few that have offices that are known as representative offices.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
But what we understood that to mean is they're not actually banking offices. They have a designated representative who is based in Havana, but they do not have a branch or facility.
That's correct.
There.
They don't interact with kind of Cuban. They don't take Cuban deposits or anything like that. That's correct. But they do things like arrange trade financing, for example. I mean, could an American bank have set up that kind of office, or not yet?
An American bank is allowed to open an account there, but they're not allowed yet to open an office there.
Okay, so that's another step.
We have allowed other types of industry to open a physical presence, an office, a warehouse, a store, and we list those in our regulations. We say exporters, we say the travel services providers, the cargo carriers. We give a list in our regulations, religious institutions. We give the list of those that can open an office, but we're not there yet with many other industries.
Okay. Jessica, the UNDP has been in Cuba for many years, and it does quite a range of work with the Cuban government and with Cuban institutions in general. Perhaps you could just give us a sense of what you do and how that's changing as the island changes, no?
Indeed, we have been there since 1973. Cuba is a member state of the United Nations. Our work right now focuses on mainly three areas: the economic, the social, and environmental. In the economic, we are involved in supporting the government in the implementation of their how they call their updating of the economic Cuban model and the many guidelines that go with it. For us, very important changes and work that we are doing, for instance, is in the promotion of the foreign direct investment. We are supporting the creation of an agency to promote foreign direct investment, which is what they are focused on. We're also helping on issues related to credit for small credit or micro credit to small entrepreneurs or cuenta propistas. The creation of value chains to promote efficiency within the cooperatives, the agriculture and non-agricultural co-ops as well. So these are some of the areas, for instance, in the economic area. In the environmental part, which is probably the largest part of our portfolio, we have supported the establishment of a very strong renewable energy policy. Their energy bill is very high, and they have the intention of going by year 2030 into a 25% of self-sufficient renewable energy, for instance. So this is which is part of the package of foreign direct investment as well that they're putting out. Cuba is also vulnerable to many of the environmental issues that a small island development state is. They're prone to hurricanes, to these areas, for instance, and we have worked with them not only in strengthening their already strong disaster risk reduction capabilities, but also in helping the rest of the Caribbean as a South-South cooperation area. In the social areas, we're also supporting in that there are already strong gains in the social sector. For instance, we all know that Cuba is has made one of the most advances in Latin America, if not the highest, in terms of their education, their health systems. But we also are supporting them, for instance, in achieving the program against HIV/AIDS. They have recently been the first country in the world, actually, that have eradicated mother-to-child transmission in HIV/AIDS, and that has been a major contribution through the Global Fund, which we implement jointly with the government of Cuba, but also enabling access to knowledge, technology, expertise, especially in the areas of health, biotechnology, and of course also part of this South-South cooperation, and already Alex mentioned some of it, is Cuba has made a great contribution, for instance, to the work in Ebola through their doctors, through their so cooperation outside of Cuba, doctors for cholera in Haiti, for instance. So this is some of the areas that we have also enabled in Cuba. So it's a wide area. We count there with highly educated and very competent counterparts in our project. So that's what we have right now.
Just to pick up on those economic initiatives, I mean, can you tell us a bit about how this microcredit initiative might work, what stage it's got to? I mean, would this be a Cuban government agency? Would there be a role for foreign investors or donors? Or?
Well, these are, we consider that Cuba has been, establishing or implementing their lineamientos, their guidelines steadily and keeping the course, sometimes not as fast as would be expected, but on keeping on track since 2010. One of them has been the opening on the enlarging the non-state sector. Already, I think it was John or Matthew mentioned about it, that's right, the growth in the cooperatives, in the self-employment. So this issue of credit has been actually how it's still a very small, very incipient, because their banking system also needs quite a bit of updating. They also have quite a bit of limitations, including the issue of currency as well. But so it hasn't really come to be an agency as such or a structure, but there is already through government, through their banking system, a small credit for especially for co-ops and self-employment. It's still at a very small amounts. So this is part of the work that we have, how it has evolved. I mean, these are may seem as small steps, but they're actually giant steps in this mechanism in Cuba. We think, like everything, of course, credit is a extremely important part of if you want to see a private sector grow. The issue of credit is also a very important thing. For instance, is a cultural issue. We were, as an anecdote, we were discussing that even though there is some credit, very small credit, I think it's we're talking of less than or somewhere equivalent of $500 or so, but some of the self-employed still don't go for credit. They don't have this sense of being indebted yet. So this is a culture also that needs to change within the island. Yeah.
And just on foreign direct investment, I mean, they passed a new law, which but there are still big issues there around sort of labor arrangements and so on. No? I mean, there are opportunities there's a special regime in the Mariel Free Trade Zone and so on. But again, I mean, how do you see the Cuban take on what more they need to do to attract more foreign investment?
Okay. I was a UN official in the late 90s when Cuba actually opened to foreign direct investment in a way for the first time. That was when the hotels started to open. And it's now almost 15 years after I was there for the first time posted, that they have relatively booming tourist industry. And in a way, this new wave of foreign investment, it is a new wave, but there has been steadily growing foreign investment. And one of the strengths perhaps is that they have been keeping the rules of the game clearly. This new part, I mean, they have recently put out, I believe that they have estimated that they need a $2.5 billion foreign investment to achieve the 4% growth. They have put out, I think, a portfolio, let's call it, of about $8 billion worth of projects that include projects in the in the Special Economic Development Zone of El Mariel, but also in very interesting and innovative areas, such as the renewable energy, for instance, that requires technology investment, but that will also have not only benefit for the island, but I think is an important area to invest, but also innovation in other areas of technology. They have already invested for decades into a biotechnology area, health, for instance, where you already have a very strong human capital there. They have scientists and all that, but it's a new step that I imagine for investors is important, that they have a human capital there, but they lack resources, they lack infrastructure, they lack access to technology, hard technology. And these are some of the opportunities. Of course, with drawbacks, they're still, limited in terms of their infrastructure. But these are the opportunities we see. We have been promoting with capacity to promote this, right? A capacity of their own to promote the foreign direct investment. And they recently put out a fair. I seem to think that a lot of people have come to look, but they still yet to arrive the actual investments,
Sure.
but they have already some.
Getting to the deals
That's right,
it
yeah.
takes
Some
time.
of them
doesn't
have.
it?
Some of them have.
Thank you very much.